Today, I'm going to talk about the 14th century North African writer Ibn Khaldun, believed by many to be the smartest man who ever lived.
You're that smart.
Let me put it this way. Have you ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates?
Yes?
Morons.
That didn't really need a clip from The Princess Bride. Actual academics have said that, or close enough, about Ibn Khaldun, that he's the greatest thinker of all time, the founder of sociology, the most insightful economist who ever lived, a sort of intellectual prophet. And they are all wrong. So grab a cup of tea, make yourself comfortable. This is going to be a long episode. And an unusual one. Normally there's a very big filter between the research and reading I do for an episode, which can be hours, days, weeks or even months, and the few minutes you actually listen to. But here I am going to structure the episode to reflect my research process, starting with how I got curious about the reception of Ibn Khaldun, about why people take him so seriously, in particular as an economist, and then walk you through the process I use to understand that. No, it won't take weeks. I'm still filtering this a bit, but you'll need that cup of tea. Hit pause and go and get it. I can wait. The very first video I did in this series, before I even called it Historical Perspective, when I was still holding my microphone the wrong way round, was tangentially about Ibn Khaldun. That video is no longer on the channel, so I better explain what it was about. Then candidate for Conservative Party leader Boris Johnson made the following remark as an argument for lower taxes.
Ibn Khaldun pointed out as early as the 14th century, there are plenty of taxes that you can cut, which will actually increase your revenues.
I was struck by the inaccuracy of the statement and that someone would think to make it at all, and I gave my thoughts on both. Johnson's laziness and faux intellectualism are no longer news, and the point I made about the danger of projecting modern concepts like economics onto pre-modern texts are better made in a subsequent video I did on the historian Moses Finley, which is why the video is no longer on the channel. But Johnson's reference is not an aberration. Ibn Khaldun is often treated as a pre-modern economist, and the Muqaddimah as a prophetic text, which predicted many later economic theories. The fact that it was written over 600 years ago in a pre-modern society and can tell us nothing about 21st century taxation is often ignored. And I thought it would be interesting to look at that reception of the text to understand why that is. And that is what I'll do today, in pretty much the order in which I would actually do the work to understand the reception of the text. First, I'll talk about the Muqaddimah itself. Then, the long bit, I'm going to go through what has been written about all of this over the last 100 years, at first in roughly chronological order, then focusing on three themes, Neo-liberalism, the gap thesis, and Islamic economics. And that structure, a lot of reading arranged in notes in chronological order, is almost exactly how I start to understand the reception of something. So we'll be following along in almost exactly the way that my notes are organised. For a full historiographic article, I would be more comprehensive. In this case, I've probably only read about 50 to 100 articles and books, and I would look at other things. I'll try and note some of those unexplored avenues along the way. But hopefully you'll get a sense of the approach and how, with sensitivity to intent, interest, interactions and influence, those individual bits of reading knit together into a fabric that reveals general trends. In this case, in the reception of Ibn Khaldun in the English-speaking world. English-speaking as I have neither the time nor language skills to look at work in French, German, Turkish and Urdu, which are clearly an important part of this. First, let's talk about the Muqaddimah. A quick note on pronunciation. I read and write about this stuff. I've heard numerous pronunciations. Khaldun, Khaldun, that weird sound in lock English people can't do. Don't put any faith in how I pronounce a name or a title. Ibn Khaldun wrote a wide variety of works, but almost universally, people mean a very specific section of a very specific work. Kitab al-Ibar is a history of North Africa divided into 3 books. The term Muqaddimah is used synonymously with the first book, which is itself divided into 6 chapters. The text begins, as texts often do, by telling us how smart the author is and how important the work is. Nothing odd here, except that modern writers often accept this far more credulously than it really deserves. The introduction then outlines a fairly unsophisticated theory of history, imagining the historian's task as one of stitching together disparate accounts, and that the skill of the historian lay primarily in their ability to critically assess the veracity or otherwise of each account. I'll give just one example of this for flavour, and partly because as the episode proceeds, this will seem increasingly ironic. Analogical reasoning and comparison are not safe from error. Often someone who has learned a great deal of past history remains unaware of the changes that conditions have undergone. Without a moment's hesitation, he applies his knowledge of the present to the historical information, and measures such information by the things he has observed with his own eyes, although the difference between the two is great. After this theory of history, there then follows a topical discussion, starting with the necessity for social organisation, an account of geography, a very lengthy discussion of prophecy and other forms of inspired or supernatural knowledge, which Khaldun absolutely believes in. Chapter 2 then elaborates at length on the difference between pastoralist and sedentary peoples, and on the central concept of asabiyya, usually translated as group feeling. It is here that Khaldun's 4-generation model is expounded. This is as follows. The builder of the family's glory knows what it cost him to do the work, and he keeps the qualities that created his glory and made it last. The son who comes after him had personal contact with his father, and thus learned those things from him. However, he is inferior to him in this respect, inasmuch as a person who learns things through study is inferior to a person who knows them from practical application. The 3rd generation must be content with imitation, and in particular with reliance upon tradition. This member is inferior to him of the 2nd generation, inasmuch as a person who relies upon tradition is inferior to a person who exercises independent judgment. The 4th generation, then, is inferior to the preceding ones in every respect. Its member has lost the qualities that preserved the edifice of its glory. He despises those qualities. Khaldun restates this in various forms extensively here and in chapter 3. I'm not entirely on board with reading it either as a literal description of dynastic change or purely as a metaphor. Khaldun seems to have intended something more concrete than an analogy, but not quite a prescriptive formula. Chapter 3 covers a lot of the same sort of themes as chapter 2. But where the focus there was on pastoralist societies, the focus here is on the structure of power in the royal dynasties that rule over sedentary societies. And yes, inevitably, some of this talks about government officers related to public finances, sometimes just matter-of-fact observations. And often it touches on a discussion of taxation. For example, in describing the end of a dynasty, Khaldun says this: when luxury increases in a dynasty and people's income becomes insufficient for their needs and expenses, the ruler, that is, the government, must increase their allowance in order to tide them over and remedy their unsound condition. The amount of tax revenue, however, is a fixed one. It neither increases nor decreases. That is fairly typical. Khaldun seems to conceive of the problem not in terms of setting tax policy, but in terms of spending beyond the dynasty's means, not atypical for his time's mercantilist thinking. It is that spending is too high, or that taxes are unjust, not the level of taxation, which is the problem. But weaved in there is an idea that taxes can be counterproductive. And this is the bit that was misquoted by Johnson. The strongest incentive for cultural activity is to lower as much as possible the amount of individual imposts levied upon persons capable of undertaking cultural enterprises. In this manner, such persons will be psychologically disposed to undertake them because they can be confident of making a profit from them. It is worth noting that while sections like this read like a policy proposal, the general framing works against that reading. Hundreds of pages up to this point have been spent suggesting that the rise and fall of dynasties operates in an almost clockwork fashion. Part of the reason for that is that the Muqaddimah seems to suggest the state is caught in a bind. If instead of raising taxes, it tries to lower expenditure, and it's repeatedly clear that taxes are a symptom of expenditure, not a policy choice, that leads to the same result. If the ruler holds on to property and revenue, gifts which they, in their turn, had been used to give to their entourage and people, stop, and all their expenditure is cut down. They constitute the greatest number of people who make expenditures, and their expenditure provides more of the substance of trade than that of any other group. When they stop spending, business slumps and commercial profits decline. Should we read this as a fatalistic conception? The dynasties are doomed to rise and fall in a perpetual cycle. I'm not sure, but the metaphor of age suggests that. If senility is something natural to the life of the dynasty, it must come about in the same way natural things come about, exactly as senility affects the temper of living beings. Senility is a chronic disease that cannot be cured or made to disappear because it is something natural, and natural things do not change. Now, to make the point that I'm operating selectively here, we get a whole bunch of other topics. For example, Khaldun spends time ascribing epidemics to bad humours, or justifying the use of astronomical observations, in this case the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. Note that the times, 960 years, 240 years and 20 years, do not line up with the chronology of political change in other sections, and Khaldun frequently vacillates on the utility of astronomy. The point is that what is often treated as a text that predicts modern economic thinking is intermingled with a lot of stuff that from a 21st century point of view is entirely unrelated. Chapter 4 looks at towns and cities, urban life, and so again we get a scattering of material that is, from a modern perspective, economic. Amongst the interesting elements is the tendency to perceive equalities. For example, income and expenditure balance each other in every city. If the income is large, the expenditure is large, and vice versa. And if both income and expenditure are large, the inhabitants become more favourably situated, and the city grows. As with mathematically inclined modern economists, it's not always clear what sustains the equality, but the text does seem wedded to the idea that the equality is always maintained. It may relate to a notion of interconnectedness, a theme that comes up repeatedly in the work. These are related matters: the strength and weakness of a dynasty, the numerical strength of a nation or race, the size of a town or city, and the amount or prosperity or wealth. This is because dynasty and royal authority constitute the form of the world and of civilization, which in turn, together with the subjects, cities and all other things, constitute the matter of dynasty and royal authority. Tax money reverts to the people. Their wealth as a rule comes from their business and people. If the ruler pours out gifts and money upon his people, it spreads among them and reverts to him, and again from him to them. It comes from them through taxation and the land tax, and reverts to them through gifts. But again, to make the point, this section is followed in short order by a homophobic rant and a moral panic about adultery. And modern commentators tend to selectively cite this passage and omit the rants, as in fact I've literally just done now. Chapter 5 is described in translation as about profit, but professions might be better. It is wide-ranging and eclectic. There is, for example, a lengthy discussion on when you should prefer the advice of a midwife over a physician. Some of it is very down-to-earth, some of it is quite obtuse, as we can see in this passage. This is very much the sort of passage that makes me worry about translation. What precisely are words like scientific, imagination, or soul translating? And that is complicated by knowing a word like scientific does not mean quite the same thing in academic discourse at the beginning of the 21st century as it did in the first half of the 20th. Its linguistic domain has narrowed, and it is a narrower term for a native English speaker than, like Rosenthal, a native German speaker, leaving a lot of layers of interpretation that need to be navigated. The final chapter, chapter 6, is a lengthy map of the nature of human knowledge, from Islamic jurisprudence and theology through supernatural knowledge, such as that of the Sufis, to physics, medicine, logic, and even lengthy discussions of Arabic and the nature of poetry. This passage I quote because I was tickled by the way it uses chess as an example, and also because of how it captures some of Khaldun's approach in this section. The degree to which a human being is able to establish an orderly causal chain determines his degree of humanity. Some people are able to establish a causal nexus for 2 or 3 levels. Some are not able to go beyond that. Others may reach 5 or 6. Their humanity, consequently, is higher. For instance, some chess players are able to perceive in advance 3 or 5 moves, the order of which is arbitrary. Others are unable to do that because their mind is not good enough for it. This example is not quite to the point because the knowledge of chess is a habit, whereas the knowledge of causal chains is something natural. Interestingly, it becomes apparent in this chapter that Khaldun is clearly embedded in an intellectual world. At one point, he complains about the proliferation of literature. At other points, there are references to a lot of predecessors, books, and contemporaries. It's not the internet, but it's also not a situation of academic isolation. And this is quite widespread. This passage suggests an awareness, albeit limited, of intellectual activity in northwestern Europe. As we'll see later, there's good reason to believe that people in northwestern Europe had some awareness of intellectual activity in the North African world that Ibn Khaldun operated in. Okay, so where was I? I've been trying to give a sense of the Muqaddimah, which, as I mentioned, is just the first part of a longer work on history, completed, according to its author, in 1377. There is a coherent logic to the volume, which is concerned with the dynamic pastoral and settled societies, and how this leads to the rise and fall of dynasties. At both the beginning and the end, Khaldun makes grandiose claims for the work. Claims we will see have been taken far too seriously. But if you do try to read the whole thing, the main impression you will get is of its length. I made myself a cup of tea, so I hope you've got one. This is not the first time that I've read Ibn Khaldun's work, but it is the first time that I've ever tried to read it from beginning to end in order. And even working with the abridged edition, it's incredibly repetitive, and there are very large sections of it that I was just really bored with. But more relevant to the reception of the work as a pre-modern economist is how alien its conception of knowledge is. The text spends, particularly chapter 6, so much time mapping its general idea of how human knowledge works that the differences are obvious. We might, I think, call what's being done here statecraft, but there is no sense of economics or sociology, and much of it feels, unsurprisingly as it is over 600 years old, very dated. Having said this, it is often genuinely fascinating on a historical level when the text describes why it thinks contemporary social, legal or political structures work the way they do. And Khaldun is clearly insightful. Whether that is brilliance or simply being well read, it's hard to say. Selection is a problem here, and you should absolutely consider the possibility that my particular selection is misrepresenting the original work. In fact, no. You should be certain that my selection is misrepresenting the actual work. It is doing that. But you should also be very cautious that maybe it's misrepresenting the work on the very specific point that I want to describe to you. It is incredibly easy to do that, even if you're not trying to do it deliberately. And you should always bear that in mind when looking at anything like that. How much is the process of selection shifting your view of how the work operates, given that you haven't read the work directly yourself? Anyway, with that in mind, I think it's time to move over to the question of reception. Yes, we are only just finishing the introduction here. I did say it would be a long episode. Ibn Khaldun's work was picked up almost immediately by scholars interested in politics and statecraft. By 1636, one of his followers, Ibn Arab Shah, had been translated into Latin, and in the 17th century, the Muqaddimah was translated in the Ottoman Empire, where it was used to analyse the perceived decline of that polity. Khaldun's work has enjoyed a continuity of study from its initial publication. It is not, like many ancient authors, something which passed into a long period of obscurity and was subsequently recovered. There was no real European discovery. The Muqaddimah has a continuous intellectual thread which connects its initial publication to modern academia quite directly. Inan summarises the beginning of intense European interest as follows. In 1697, the first European biography of Ibn Khaldun appeared in de Herbelet's Bibliothèque Orientale. In 1806, the French Orientalist Sylvestre de Sacy published a biography of Ibn Khaldun, together with a translation of some passages of the Prolegomena. Prolegomena is the term 19th century people use when they're translating Muqaddimah, because literally just means introduction. In 1816, he again published a lengthy biography of Ibn Khaldun in his Biographie Universelle, together with an ample description of the Prolegomena. At the time, the Austrian Orientalist von Hammer-Purgstall published in 1812 on the decline of Islam after the first 3 centuries of the Hijra, in which he particularly referred to some of Ibn Khaldun's theories on the decline of states and described him as the Montesquieu of the Arabs. The Muqaddimah was fully translated into French between 1862 and 1868. French colonial interests in North Africa meant there was more money and interest for work on a 14th century Algerian than there was in the English-speaking world. And by the late 19th century, Khaldun's work, or rather this one specific piece of work, was well known, though the bulk of the scholarship was in French, and a lot of it still is. It was quickly adopted into French philosophy, and it seems to be through French philosophy that English writers first noticed it. In 1893, Flint writes in his Historical Philosophy in France, "The first writer to treat history as the proper object of a special science was Muhammad ibn Khaldun. Whether on this account he is to be regarded or not as the founder of the science of history is a question as which there may well be differences of opinion. But no candid reader of his Prolegomena can fail to admit that his claim to the honour is more valid than that of any author previous to Vico." Giambattista Vico was born in 1668, 262 years after Ibn Khaldun's death, and that is one of the elements in academic evaluations of Khaldun that remains very persistent and is there from the beginning. The idea that he is a founder or a remarkable precursor of intellectual developments, a sort of intellectual prophet, whose insights would not be independently realised until centuries after his death. But the key point at this stage is that nobody is talking about this in connection with economics. This is a historian. The work is a theory of political history. And exactly when that changes is not really clear to me, in part because the change happened in French and German scholarship, sometime between 1900 and 1930, in the intellectual milieu that also produces the Annals School, with its argument that historians should draw on the relatively new social sciences to theoretically reinvigorate their discipline. I know of a publication by Schmidt in 1926 and work by Monnier in 1930, which were certainly talking about the economics of Khaldun, and at least one English review of a German work by Rosenthal, which mentions the specific tax issue that sparked my interest. In that review, Thompson writes, "In the present plight of the world, probably the most interesting chapter in Part 2 is that which deals with the relationship of the state to business. The state, says Ibn Khaldun, is the greatest of all markets, and must see to it that the money which it receives in taxation circulates back again to the people, for the circulation of money is the basis of sound economy. In the first phase, taxation is light, and the inhabitants are encouraged to work by the profit which they receive from their labour. Thus the income of the state increases. But when defence necessitates heavier taxation, the will to work is weakened and the income of the state decreases. Low taxation is the best incentive to work, and there is a point above which any increases in tax make work profitless, whereupon income from it ceases." This is written by an American in the wake of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. So zero surprise that economics is what they find interesting. In the wake of the crash, the United States significantly increased the tax burden, particularly on the wealthy, in what became known as the New Deal. It was under this regime of high taxation that the United States recovered. Wealthy people opposed it at the time. Political thinkers have argued over it since. Those who believe government spending necessitates taxes argue the New Deal was a good thing and facilitated recovery from the Depression, while those who argue low taxes make everyone wealthier suggest the New Deal slowed the recovery and made the Depression worse. And a lot of that literature makes no more than a pretense to academic rigour, but because the boundaries of serious academic work are porous, this often bleeds back as a political inflection into academic journals, sort of like it does in that review. And I'm making a lot out of a review that, as far as I know, nobody has ever referenced, before getting to the thing from the 1930s that everyone does reference, Arnold Toynbee's A Study of History. I almost certainly need to explain who Toynbee is, because today, when discussed, it is almost always remarked how Toynbee, despite a mid-century vogue, has vanished into obscurity. Conceived in 1921, A Study of History was published in 12 volumes between 1934 and 1961, and argued for a set of general principles for the rise and fall of civilizations. It should be unsurprising then that Ibn Khaldun, by that point well known in French academic circles, would feature given the similarly cyclical approach to history. And to give a flavour of the interaction, here is an excerpt from the 1971 abridged edition. The Arab invasion of northwest Africa in the 7th century of the Christian era had not only left this region's economic life intact, it had been followed by an increase in North Africa's economic prosperity. By contrast, the effect of the invasion of the same region, in and after AD 1051, by two Arab tribes, the Banu Hilal and the Banu Sulaim, had been devastating economically and disruptive politically. A few notes. Toynbee repeats the evaluation of French philosophers that Khaldun is a figure of exceptional insight. But, and this he must have picked up from the discussions we have only hinted at in the early decades of the 20th century, Toynbee frames Khaldun's questions in terms of economics. And that is a useful point to bear in mind with any historiography. It's going to keep coming up today that the reality of intellectual history consists of this constant chatter, people talking to each other at seminars, in coffee rooms, over lunch in the London School of Economics, where Toynbee worked. But that provisional speculative thinking out loud is often lost or inaccessible. It's not impossible to recover. If I were diving deeper, I'd absolutely be looking at oral history, lecture notes, private letters, diaries, etc. What we see in books are a small number of works, polished and considered statements of positions, and it can seem like they are the only thing that matters. For example, Irwin remarks, Toynbee did more than anyone else to popularise Ibn Khaldun's theories to the English-speaking world. But is that really true? Toynbee is referenced a lot, but would he have been referenced if people were not already predisposed to see Khaldun as an important thinker, the Muqaddimah as a precursor to economics? Which is why the uncited review I talked about first was interesting. It's a little less formal, a little bit closer to those coffee room conversations. Of course, that is not to say that publications don't matter, just that we should guard against logocentrism, the assumption that the only important things that were said are those which survive in written form. And having said that, let us move to a publication which really did matter, the translation I am using by Rosenthal. Rosenthal had already translated large sections of the Muqaddimah into German by the 1930s, and if not for political events, would have undoubtedly produced a complete translation in German. However, as a scholar of Jewish descent, Rosenthal was unable to continue working in Germany and, in danger of his life, fled in 1933 to take up a position at Yale, and in 1958 published a translation of the Muqaddimah, universally used today. Rosenthal's circumstances are not that unusual. We'll talk later about Joseph Schumpeter, who also fled Germany in the 30s and ended up at Harvard. I've encountered a few dissenting opinions on the quality of Rosenthal's translation. I'll cite Al-Azmeh because while it's idiosyncratic, I think it's useful to have a counterpoint. The best translation of the Muqaddimah is still that of Deslane, which shows remarkable sensitivity to Ibn Khaldun's style, to his metaphor, and to his terminology. Not so sensitive or readable, the English translation of Rosenthal evinces a systematic misreading of Khaldun's text and constitute distortions of his terminology and of his arguments in what appears a literalist translation, devoid of subjectivity. The only saving grace of the Rosenthal translation is that it is provided with an excellent index along with copious notes to the text on persons mentioned, books quoted, and the like. I'm not competent to evaluate this, and I have seen other people raise issues with Rosenthal's translation, but the honest answer is Teslain doesn't get used. Everybody uses Rosenthal. Rosenthal is the standard translation. If you can, use the original, not the abridged edition, but the abridged edition is freely available on the internet, so I'll forgive you for using that. After all, when I decided to reread the whole thing, that's what I used. In his introduction, Rosenthal discusses the difficulty of translating a technical work from a very different time and place, beginning by describing the continuum of options available to the translator. A work may be presented to the modern reader in one of three ways. It may be translated as literally as the second language permits. The translator may go further and use modern phraseology and style. Or finally, the work may be recast and given the form it would have had it been written by a contemporary author in the second language. However, as Rosenthal points out, there are trade-offs in each of these decisions. The drawback of any completely literal translation is obvious. It may easily be incomprehensible to the general reader. On the other hand, updating and reworking has pitfalls. One is the danger of distorting the author's ideas by modernising, and therefore attributing to him thoughts that were utterly foreign to him. As we've already covered, that's exactly a risk that exists in this case. We have a pre-modern author who understands what they are doing as history, and we are looking at how that is read as economics. That slippage is part of the Muqaddimah's reception, and Rosenthal is raising a fundamental question here. Is the modern reception perceiving something that is in the text and ahead of its time, or is it reading its own concerns into it in a way its original author would neither have recognised nor intended? Before we continue, I want to draw attention to another remark. 100 years ago, very few printed Arabic texts existed, and nearly all the pertinent information was still buried in manuscripts. Even nowadays, when a good part of Arabic literature has become available in printed form, it is often necessary in connection with the Muqaddimah to refer to manuscripts. Stick a pin in that. The extent to which Islamic texts were translated will be important later. For now, note that Rosenthal is highlighting that at the moment European scholars first declared Khaldun was exceptional and without peers, they were making those fundamentally comparative statements without actually having anything to compare it against. Perhaps Tabari or Battuta, but essentially as close to nothing as makes no difference. And that sounds weird. How do you know if something is exceptional if you only actually know about that thing? But it is far more common than you might expect. People often make assessments of the relative merits of a work without regard for how it actually relates to other works, which is why exercises like this, and particularly following a thread chronologically, are useful. Things often look very different when contextualised, when understood in relation to their own time, whether that's early 20th century scholarship or the world of a 14th century jurist. Anyway, time to get back to the reception and how it was impacted by this translation. This is one of those graphs I do based on data from JSTOR. In this case, for a search on Ibn Khaldun and for a second search with the extra term economic. As you can see, there is a really notable upswing in the 1950s, and Rosenthal's translation is both cause and effect in that. Without translations, scholarship is always limited. Yes, all of the ideas that circulated around Ibn Khaldun were there before Rosenthal, but as you had to read French, Turkish or Arabic fluently enough to engage with it, and that isn't a universal skill set, there was a linguistic barrier to the study. In the decades immediately after the translation, we get several discussions in quite diverse places of the Muqaddimah and its relation to economic thought. I am going to focus on just three of these. by Spengler, Ahmad and Boulakia, because they approach the question in similar ways and represent a growing consensus on that thought. They all extract from the much longer text small snippets to bind together into an evaluation of the economic thought that underpins it. All three agree in their general evaluation, which includes that what they are doing is somewhat alien to Khaldun's own thinking. As Ahmad writes, economic issues were considered together with those of ethics, politics, law and religion. They formed no separate science, but lay mingled with other bodies of doctrine. But all do agree on the novelty and insight, Boulakia putting it most strongly. Ibn Khaldun discovered a great number of fundamental economic notions a few centuries before their official births. He discovered the virtues and the necessity of a division of labour before Smith and the principle of labour value before Ricardo. He elaborated a theory of population before Malthus and insisted on the role of the state before Keynes. That is, as we have noted, essentially a restatement of the evaluation first made by French philosophers, and then by Toynbee, that Khaldun was exceptional, in some sense prophetic. Something Spengler tries to explain. Probably more responsible for what Toynbee calls the flash-in-the-pan impact of Ibn Khaldun's work was the cut-and-dried character of Egyptian Arabic civilization and the inability of this civilization to render Islamic culture dynamic and fruitful within the framework of an Ottoman Empire that finally absorbed Egypt in 1517. Passages like this recur frequently in the reception, explaining that the Muqaddimah was so out of place, so exceptional, it was ignored and not built on. As we will see and already have seen a little of, they ignore that it did draw on previous work and that people did engage with it, i.e. its perceived exceptionalism is often dependent on an ignorance of its context. All three then frame some version of Khaldun's account of the rise and fall of dynasties in terms of economics. This is Spengler's version. Initially, taxes would be low, in keeping with Islamic law, with the result that enterprises would increase in number and size and thus permit tax-based tax revenue and governmental surplus to grow. In time, however, royal expenditure increased, with the result that private expenditure, especially on non-necessities, also increased and intensified the money cost of manpower and other objects of royal expenditure. It then became necessary for the government, if it would continue expenditure at a high and rising rate, to increase assessments and tax rates and to levy more and higher customs duties. Presently, taxation began to eat so heavily into business profits that business enterprise was discouraged, finally diminishing in amount, with the result that tax revenue declined. If this seems a little more coherent and connected than my own account of the Muqaddimah, well, yes it is. Spengler is being quite selective and knitting together things not directly connected in the text. And it is this which is almost always meant when people say they are talking about Ibn Khaldun. Not Khaldun himself, not the Kitab al-Ibar, not even the section we call the Muqaddimah, or some part of it, but a distillation by Spengler or others of a coherent economic rationale to Khaldun's rise and fall of states theory. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that Khaldun would not have agreed with this, or even that he might not have recognised his own work in this evaluation. All I am saying is this is not what he wrote. By the 1970s, this had become the conventional interpretation of Ibn Khaldun's economic theory, and it is undoubtedly this, whether through reading articles or because these ideas were widely discussed, that was picked up and redeployed as policy prescriptions or justifications in the United States. From here, I'm going to be talking about a series of strands in the reception, beginning with the public and political one that first piqued my interest. And the arrangement is going to be noticeably less chronological than it has been. In terms of my own process, that restructuring began to happen about halfway through the reading as I identified common topics in articles, which were all referencing back to Toynbee, Rosenthal and Spengler, but which didn't seem to be talking to each other. It was like these three parts, the Neo-liberalism, the gap thesis and Islamic economics, were all parallel and entwined but distinct threads in the scholarship. And that's how this sort of reading works. You need a framework to begin with, and practical experience has taught me that chronology is the best framework to start off with. But as you go, you rework and you rework again, and even this version that you're seeing here is still a provisional version of my reading. If anyone's wondering about the practicalities, I do this with a large Word document and make use of the headings and navigation feature. And at this moment here, when this bit of the script was written, it looked like this. Anyway, back to the episode. In 1981, Ronald Reagan gave an answer at a press conference in which he talked about Ibn Khaldun, and I was able to find a clip.
I studied economics in college when I was young, and I learned there about a man named Ibn Khaldun, who lived 1,200 years ago in Egypt. And 1,200 years ago, he said, in the beginning of the empire, the rates were low, the tax rates were low, but the revenue was great. He said in the end of the empire, when the empire was collapsing, the rates were great and the revenue was low.
That's not wildly inaccurate. Yes, the dates are wrong, and it's clearly a citation of the secondary literature, not drawn from a reading of Khaldun himself. Was Reagan being honest about being taught this? I'm not sure. He did study for an undergraduate degree in sociology and economics, but graduated in 1932, so even Toynbee would not have been on the syllabus. Again, pursuing this as a proper research project, I would add that to a list of questions to look at. I would guess, most likely, some of his political advisors who studied in the 50s and 60s raised this idea. But these ideas weren't coming from Khaldun. So let's talk about the Laffer curve. Said to have originated over a meal amongst right-wing political advisors in 1974, Arthur Laffer sketched the curve on a napkin to explain it to Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, and it was subsequently named after Laffer by another attendee, Jude Wanniski. It became a central doctrine in neoliberal economics, which, despite the name, is a political movement rather than an economic theory. Wanniski presents it in pretty much the same manner it is always presented. First, an observation that particularly onerous taxes can be counterproductive. When the tax rate is 100%, all production ceases in the money economy. People will not work in the money economy if all the fruits of their labours are confiscated by the government. Because production ceases, government revenues are zero. And that is, quite legitimately, a point Khaldun also makes. But while it is as far as our 14th century writer goes, it is never where neoliberal discussions of the topic end. They always end by arguing that doing the opposite, lowering tax rates, will increase revenue. In the United States, in September 1977, the Republican National Committee unanimously endorsed the plan of Representative Jack Kemp of New York for cutting tax rates as a way of expanding revenues through increased business activity, writes Wanniski. Lower taxes and, paradoxically, revenue will increase, something which the very first video I made pointed out Ibn Khaldun did not argue for. Even the one section that comes closest to saying that, which we quoted earlier, is hard to read that way in context. Wanniski then cites a whole bunch of historical thinkers to support their ideas, often conflating concerns that onerous taxes are counterproductive with the policy prescription. And some time after that, but before Reagan spoke a few years later, presumably someone decided Ibn Khaldun should be added to that list of authorities. Academics were not terribly impressed. One remarked, the attempt to stretch back to the ancient scholar was superficial and misleading, a case of misguided scholarship and naive mislabeling of ideas. That did not stop the proposal becoming a significant part of Reagan's ultimately successful pitch to become the Republican nominee for president.
I still believe firmly, and I think there are some differences of opinion about figures. 4 times in this century we have had across-the-board tax cuts, all of which have resulted in such an increase in prosperity that the government, even in the first year, got increased revenues, not less.
The idea, on the face of it, and if you delve any deeper, is absurd. And even his Republican opponent recognised that, describing it as
what I call a voodoo economic policy.
But this is not theory, it's dogma. And Ibn Khaldun's authority has been passed on with it by an extended game of telephone, which was how Boris Johnson, a much less intellectually able politician than Reagan or Bush, wow, that's an achievement you would not want to be remembered for, was able to so badly misrepresent it.
Well, actually, of course, as the great Tunisian scholar and sage Ibn Khaldun pointed out as early as the 14th century, there are plenty of taxes that you can cut which will actually increase your revenues. And there are ways of making sure that you stimulate growth, you stimulate enterprise, and you get more in.
And that is where I came in, and where this series' historical perspective began, responding to the absurdity of the idea of using a 14th century writer to make decisions about 21st century economic policy. I leaned away from political commentary early in the series because it tends to date very quickly, and also because it's not my main interest. But I do want to look briefly now at subsequent events because I think they illustrate a couple of interesting historiographic points. Johnson, being quite limited in his intellectual abilities and quite fragile in his ego, sought to fill his government with people of still more limited ability. And in his ignominious fall from grace, a small group of very fervent neoliberal adherents, promoted largely for their lack of intellectual competence, headed by Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, managed to gain power and propose sweeping tax cuts.
High tax rates damage Britain's competitiveness. They reduce the incentive to work, to invest, and to start a business. And the higher the tax, the more ways people seek to avoid them, or work elsewhere, or simply work less, rather than putting their time and effort to more creative and productive ends. Take the additional rate of income tax.
And I think this is interesting in two respects. The first is that while these tax cuts were obviously self-serving, they're on personal income, which is not what Khaldun or other thinkers were worried about raising, partly because they did not live in complex bureaucratic societies, and partly because it's very hard to raise a percentage income tax enough to have the effect Khaldun was thinking of, unlike, say, customs duties. But I don't think it's dishonest. At minimum, Kwarteng must have believed it sounded plausible. It doesn't, and it was so egregiously awful that Kwarteng and Truss lost their jobs in short order, but I think they believed in the dogma that a sudden and dramatic cut would immediately cause a rise in revenue. And that is an important historiographical point in general. And a point I've made in other videos. It is usually easier to find someone who is mistaken than it is to find someone who will lie. And so most fallacious arguments, even the egregiously awful ones, are not made in bad faith. Yes, bad faith actors exist, but most bad arguments stem from more complex factors. In this case, a series of political manoeuvrings gradually excluding more competent individuals from government. A corollary to this is the relative stupidity of people in positions of authority. There is a very natural tendency for us to assume people in authority are smart, partly because they use those positions, as Khaldun used his platform, to tell us they are smart, but also as a psychological defence mechanism. Because admitting to yourself that unearned privilege, not merit, gives people a platform is scary. Come on, if you're a regular listener, you've literally just had that thought, haven't you? That maybe you're only listening and taking what I'm saying seriously because I'm a middle-class white guy and I sound like I know what I'm talking about, not because I actually do in fact know what I'm talking about. I mean, this episode excluded, you never get enough detail to really properly check my reasoning, so you are kind of taking my word for it a lot of the time. And yes, that is probably a very healthy critical self-reflection on your part. But it's not a comfortable one, is it? It's not a pleasant thought to think that the people you are depending on for your analysis of something might not actually know what they're talking about themselves. And it's why we usually don't want to think that. And we usually want to accept that people in authority do in fact know what they are talking about. So we can see why neoliberals like the way academics have read Khaldun. But surely, while interesting, this isn't directly relevant to the academic reception. Well, despite my warning that these things have no depth to them, the boundary with research is quite porous, and you do see neoliberal political dogma, and even Khaldun as an authority, seeping back into academic work. The next paper I'm going to talk about is by far the worst example I have encountered. A paper by Adil Mohammed, who at the time was employed at the University of Illinois at Springfield. People write bad papers. Writing a bad paper doesn't mean you can't write a good paper. I've written papers that I don't think fully reflect my ability. So, while I'm going to be quite critical here, I offer this in a sense of good humour, rather than simply to trash this individual academic's reputation. Mohammed claims the central argument of the Muqaddimah is that the foundation for a rising dynasty was solidarity, asabiyah, and the availability of money obtained by stimulating the growth of the business economy through deregulation, government supply of capitalists, and lower optimal tax rates. Now, I think that everyone agrees that asabiyah, the concept of group feeling, is a central part of Khaldun's thesis. But the other stuff isn't, and the point to note is not simply the ascription of ideas that do not occur in the text, that exist only in neoliberal economic dogma. It is the way the article goes on to gush about Khaldun himself. Either directly or through selective quotation, the Muqaddimah is described as a great book, a scientific analysis, the greatest work of its kind, which would have expedited the progress of economics if it had been translated earlier. Or about Khaldun as the superior of Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine.
You ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates?
Yes?
Morons.
I did say that Princess Bride clip would come back. A free market historian with critical reservations who furnishes modern economists with central ideas of the discipline. And the article credits him with discovering the Laffer curve. Just to remind you, because at this point it's hard to tell, this is a grown adult writing an academic paper, not a teenager on YouTube gushing over their favourite pop band, but is just an extreme version of the academic reception Khaldun has received, which this article pushes so far it transforms it into an unintentional self-parody, so that its absurdity becomes very obvious. Becomes very obvious to us. Obviously, it wasn't obvious to the author, an actual economist employed by an American university, or to the editors or reviewers of an actual academic journal in 2004. Unfortunately, it's not unique. Giovanni Patriarca and the Italian-German School at Hamburg should probably also feel some embarrassment for this article that begins, "In the history of Islamic philosophy, Ibn Khaldun deserves a place of honour. His analytical method is a perennial contribution to the analysis of social dynamics. His critique of the omnipotence of the state, his denunciation of high fiscal spending, and his exaltation of political freedom show him to be a precursor of modern political science and of classical liberalism. His imperishable fame survives today, particularly for the Muqaddimah." Note words like perennial and imperishable, which show a lack of awareness of disciplinary progress and present Khaldun as somehow prophetic. Khaldun cannot be both a classical and a neoclassical economist, both a Marxist and a Keynesian, a founder of sociology and the originator of neoliberalism. This isn't a prophetic textbook. Some of these things have contradictory assumptions. If they genuinely all shared space in the model, it wouldn't be brilliant, it would be incoherent. And the claim here that Khaldun anticipated neoliberal dogma post-dates that dogma being well known. In fact, that is universally true of economic scholarship on Khaldun, whose work, remember, has been available for over 200 years. No one ever reads Khaldun and discovers some insight previously unavailable to their discipline. Only ever finding Khaldun ideas after their discipline has already discovered and popularised them. And we will come back to that point of prophecy in a later section. But in the next section, we need to look at a part of economic history which ought to have led to a re-evaluation of Khaldun, but didn't. Schumpeter 1955 is one of those misleading inline references that doesn't result from clumsy social science practices. The book was indeed published in 1955, but Joseph Schumpeter died in 1950. It was, as a number of influential books in the post-war decade were, published posthumously, and that is important because it means the work significantly predates the English translation of the Muqaddimah by a great deal more than the 3 years Schumpeter 1955 and Rosenthal 1958 imply. In his history of economic analysis, Schumpeter famously, can I say famously about an academic subject this obscure, remarked that after the Greco-Roman period, so far as our subject is concerned, we may safely leap over 500 years to the epoch of St. Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica is in the history of thought what the southwestern spire of the Cathedral of Chartres is in the history of architecture. If, like me, you have no idea why the southwestern spire of Chartres is important, is it particularly significant in the Gothic? Please, if you're a specialist in medieval architecture, do leave a comment and explain to me what's so special about that spire. But if you don't know, then I think you can still infer from context that it was somehow innovative. To me, this feels like an offhand remark, a brief explanation that Schumpeter, in relating the history of economic thought, simply isn't aware of any text because this kind of research is very logocentric in that period. But a group of academics did not see it as an offhand remark. Beginning in 1990 and for over a decade and a half, S.M. Ghaznafar has been writing articles, more than a dozen were collected together in 2003, on this subject, coining and popularising the term Great Gap Thesis to describe Schumpeter's position. Ghaznafar's argument, the support it has received from other economic historians, and the persistence with which they felt the need to pursue it suggests that the remark is symbolic of widely held ideas. Counter to which, Ghaznafar argued, first, that between 700 and 1300 AD there were many texts which contained economic ideas, written primarily in Arabic and Persian. Second, that these texts developed significantly beyond the work available in Greek and Latin, with which Schumpeter leaves off in the 8th century. Third, that the developments were then communicated to European writers, like Aquinas, in the 13th century, and explain the apparent advances at that time. And fourthly, that Schumpeter and other proponents of the Great Gap intentionally ignored these Arabic writers, excluding them from economic history to the detriment of the subject as a whole. Very quickly, the first of these points is incontestable. As we have seen, Spengler, Boulakia and Ahmad recognised all of this in the 1960s. The second and third points are certainly true, at least if we accept the assumptions and definitions of the economic historians involved. I've mentioned in passing how logocentric I find all of this. There is an underlying assumption that if someone did not write it down, that no one thought it. Some of these texts that are discussed in the kind of history of economic thought as if the first time an idea was had are obviously just repeating things that people had been talking about for thousands of years, but we just don't have records of the older stuff. I'm thinking there of texts like the Moneta. And I think that's a conceptual difference between the way I, as a historian, who's only ever worked with people in museums, thinks about the past, and the way an economic historian, who economic historians are almost all based in economics departments, not in history departments, thinks about the past. And I think, I wanted to just cut in and make that point, that I accept that in the terms these people are thinking that those points are true, but I do genuinely have problems with the way that they're thinking about this. However, it's the fourth point that is most controversial. Ghaznafar cites both scholars who suspect prejudice and those who simply think it is ignorance, and writes himself, even if one grants that despite evidence to the contrary, there was not much available during Schumpeter's time to allow exploration into medieval intellectual links between the Arabs and the scholastics, the wealth of research since then no longer absolves economic historians, indeed the profession generally, to allow this lapse in objectivity to persist. Obviously, this wasn't simply a criticism, it was also a programme, a call to recover the history of economic thought. And I think I can illustrate both how much material we are talking about, how much work that involves, and also evaluate the claim that Schumpeter and the economic history establishment had deliberately slighted Islamic thought by looking at a book by Yassine Esid, published in 1995. Esid looks at two groups of Islamic literature, what is called the Mirror of Princes literature, which are normative tracts on good governance, and the Hizbah, or market manuals. The first part of the book introduces the Mirror of Princes, using 10 works from the 8th to the 11th century, before discussing the Arabic reception of Aristotle's letter to Alexander. A quick aside on dates, in case you're unfamiliar with this, you often get two dates separated by a / in works on Islamic history. The first, smaller number is a date in the Hijra. If the text has a colophon with a date in it, then it's going to be a date in the Hijra. The Hijra is a lunar calendar, so it does not line up with the Common Era. A single Hijra year might overlap two Common Era years, and you cannot simply add or subtract a number. For example, Al-Muqaddimah was born in 102 Hijra, which is 618 years earlier than the Common Era date equivalent, but Ibn Khaldun's birth in 732 is just 600 years earlier than its Common Era equivalent. Oh yeah, all of these works are much, much earlier than the Muqaddimah. The point of this detour will become clear, but if you've been listening for this long, then I'm suspecting you're in it till the end. I've noted the only two of these where Esid cites an English translation. Put a pin in that for the moment. But for now, let's look at the second part, where Esid makes a similar survey of the Hizbah manuals. This is a much more novel type of work. Things like the Mirror of Princes we get all across the ancient world. But the Hizbahs they're almost slightly modern in their conception. They are practical administrative guides for a class of political officials responsible for managing markets in cities. 9 works are listed here from the 9th to the 15th century, though the dates of the authors are less clear than for the previous section. I noted only one English translation, though the situation is better in French for this class of literature. Most of these have French translations. But you will notice that even when this stuff has been translated, it was often translated after Schumpeter's death, and Esid notes much of it is still, in fact, in manuscript form. A point which, of course, Rosenthal made in the 1950s. If you're surprised that large parts of Arabic literature are not yet translated, well, yeah, I was too the first time I ever tried to go and do some research on it and found this out. But it's true. There are huge chunks, and it's not actually exclusive to Arabic literature, huge chunks of texts that are essentially completely inaccessible to any but a handful of specialist scholars. Let us stop for a moment to take stock. As we can see, before 1950, there just wasn't an awareness of Islamic literature, which earlier in the episode you will remember was Rosenthal's assessment in 1958. It is still very much in the process of being published in usable forms, but before 1950 it might as well have not existed, and as we have seen, there are dozens of works, at minimum, of some interest for economic thought. Which I think raises 2 questions. The first is about what we make of the gap thesis. We appear to have 2 conflicting pieces of data. Earlier, I read the traces we saw in articles in the 60s and 70s as the tip of an iceberg, below which was lots of chatter in coffee rooms and lecture halls about Khaldun. But if a group of academics could believe that the gap thesis was a deliberate slighting rather than just ignorance of Islamic thought, as late as the 1990s, that implies the exact opposite. How do we reconcile that discrepancy? I can't do it here today, but there will be records in departments. There will be schedules of lectures of different courses. There will be lecture notes. There will be private correspondence. Somebody could genuinely do a very interesting intellectual history using that question as the seed. But yeah, it's probably beyond me to do it. The second question it raises, which I think is more important for us today, is why has there been no re-evaluation of Ibn Khaldun? What do I mean by that? Well, try to think yourself into the early 20th century position, where Khaldun is the only thinker you have read summaries of. Remember, unless you're fluent in Turkish or French, no translations yet. The Muqaddimah seems like this exceptional work, out of time, a progenitor to so much of Western economic thought. But that is an evaluation you are making against European writers just a few centuries after the Tunisian on one hand, and against Roman and Greek writers a millennia earlier. Yes, Khaldun looks sophisticated compared to the scholastics, but Al-Azmeh and colleagues have shown the scholastics were massively indebted to a huge body of Arabic and Persian literature, a body of literature that Khaldun would have had much more direct and easy access to in Cairo. Why, if we follow Al-Azmeh's lead and see the European 13th and 14th century economic thought as derivative of, and at best, an incremental step beyond that earlier literature, do we not equally now see Khaldun as derivative of and an incremental step on from that literature? How original was he, given all of the evidence we did not have 100 years ago for the thought of those he relied on? I think there are a lot of reasons that Khaldun, and particularly his contribution to economics and social sciences, has not been the subject of a widespread re-evaluation. People have tried, and I will mention a few of them later. And I think some of those are fairly obvious reasons. There are people working from the secondary literature, like the neoliberals, who are incentivised to repeat and popularise the 19th century evaluation of Ibn Khaldun, and are just as ignorant of his contemporaries as people were in the 19th century. In projects like The Great Gap, though it logically leads to a re-evaluation, the purpose of the project is primarily to correct and neglect, not bash Khaldun. And yes, it would seem Orientalist, Eurocentric and Islamophobic to do so. I'm sure, even though this is the only intellectually honest way this can be framed, some people will suspect me of using it as a cover to denigrate Arabic and Islamic thought. And beyond saying I'm not doing that, which doesn't carry very much weight if I'm suspected of bad faith, there is not much I can do about that evaluation. And I think a lot of scholars probably thought it just wasn't worth picking a fight on the issue. Finally, there's a fairly mundane reason. People working on the Muqaddimah, who are the people who are best placed to actually see this and do a re-evaluation, have very little incentive to diminish the importance of the text they work on. I've actually been criticised by colleagues for doing this. People have tried to persuade me to rewrite the introductions of articles or books, in which essentially I've said, the thing I'm about to tell you about just isn't that important. It's not groundbreaking, it's not earth-shattering, it's a small incremental step forward. There are certain deceptive practices in academia that are so normalised, people don't think of them as deceptive. And lying about the relative importance of your subject is one of those. From the beginning of their studies, researchers are actively encouraged to exaggerate and lie about the importance of the thing that they are studying, to claim it's more significant, important, or worthy of interest than it really is. And I think that very mundane thing is just one of the reasons that we haven't seen this kind of re-evaluation that otherwise I might expect, having read through all of this material. But leaving aside those very obvious mundane reasons, I want to focus on one particular issue, an intellectual thread which found Khaldun very useful, and which I think is part of why the Gap thesis did not lead to a re-evaluation. That is the Islamicization of knowledge project, and particularly Islamic economics. Project is a little bit misleading. This is a broad intellectual movement rather than a specific research team, similar to and related to post-colonialism. Alatas summarises it as follows. Islamic economics was conceived of in the 1930s, while the beginning of the Islamicization of knowledge project can be traced back to the 1970s. Islamic social sciences seek to bring back religious experience and spirituality into knowledge by means of the sacralization of academic discourse. From my reading around this, I would suggest the project has two components. A normative component, which essentially conventional economic thought is applied within a culturally specific value system. How, for example, do central banks work if lending money on interest is prohibited? And an epistemic component, which challenges the foundations and truth claims of the economic discipline as conventionally conceived in the West. Most articles contain some mixture of these elements, with the normative tending to predominate, but I think the epistemic is the more interesting, historiographically, and explains why Ibn Khaldun plays such a central role. From my reading, I found a lot of this material very slight, often begins with very hand-wavy references to things, briefly summarises Khaldun, and then just kind of stops. So in this section, I'm going to be focusing on an article from 2001 by Chapra, not because it's the most widely cited or the best and definitely not the most representative, but because it felt very concrete in its approach and therefore helps make clear what is going on. Chapra begins by setting up the basic problem, one common to post-colonial and postmodern studies, which is that the modern economic discipline originates in a very specific historical moment, the European Enlightenment. Let us all pretend for the moment we have not just been through an extended discussion of the key role Islamic North Africa played. For a concrete example, Chapra picks on the concept of Homo economus, the rational man. 18th century thought, so yes, that means men and not people. The idea is that every individual in an economic exchange seeks to maximise their own benefit. It's a central a priori assumption that underpins most economic theory. But it's not a universal truth. It is an extrapolation of historically specific 18th century European ideas. Chapra then gives an example of how this idea might apply to international trade policy. If value judgments based on moral criteria are ruled out, then the primary way of determining right from wrong would be self-interest, which all the parties would try to serve through negotiations. In such negotiations, it is generally the rich and the powerful who are able to gain the maximum advantage because of their economic and political muscle, which they use fully to bully the weak and the powerless into submission. A little bit of historical context. In the 1990s, rich Western countries through the World Bank were pushing a set of policies known as SAPs, Structural Adjustment Programs. The idea being that massively liberalising the economies of developing countries, increasing private investment and removing trade barriers would help develop those countries and greatly improve the lot of the people in them. Every single piece of competent work I've ever read on this subject suggests that the structural adjustment programs were a disaster. They didn't achieve what they were intended to. They caused massive destabilisation and human misery, and essentially all of it simply for the short-term gain and profit of rich Western countries. You can see why, in that context, Chapra is keen to argue for an approach that substitutes for the amoral rational actor some higher claim to justice, independent of self-interest. On this basis, Chapra argues it would have been better if Muslim thinking had played a part from the beginning. Good governance, on which the World Bank has now started putting emphasis, was an essential component of the interdisciplinary approach of Muslim scholars. This interdisciplinary approach reached its climax in the socio-economic and political dynamics of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. Note again the two tropes which have dominated the Muqaddimah's reception, the brilliance of its author and the prophetic nature of its analysis. To understand Chapra's paper on its own terms, we do have to come to grips with an element of doublethink that's operating here in the academic discourse. For this to make sense, Islamic economics has to work from a version of the Schumpeter gap thesis that the development of Western economic thought owes nothing to Islamic thinking, even while often overlapping with the gap project, which is all about recovering how it did. You can see here the normative and the epistemic strands. The epistemic in the sense that Western economic thought is not universally applicable because it's historically specific in its origin, and the normative in the sense that economic policy should be subordinated to values of justice and fairness. These allow Chapra to arrive at quite specific and concrete policy proposals, for example on oil prices. But there are issues. There is obviously the apple on the head problem. Just because you came to an idea through a specific and perhaps flawed line of reasoning does not demonstrate that the conclusion is flawed. Second, and more important from our point of view, is how similar the use of Ibn Khaldun is to the way the writer is used by neoliberals. Khaldun is brilliant, so far ahead of his time that his work assumes the guise of universal truth, despite being just as culturally and historically situated as the European Enlightenment, and therefore becomes an unquestionable authority. And that is important, because the epistemic thread in Islamic economics is an attempt to get an argument from authority, something deeply suspect, into the discipline by a back door. Let's recapitulate Chapra's argument. Western economic thought is value-free. It is value-free because of its specific historical origin in the European Enlightenment, and its claim to universal truth is invalid because of that specific origin. There is an alternative, the incorporation of moral judgments, justice, as central to economic thinking, and that can be seen in the work of Ibn Khaldun, work which has, for 2 centuries, been praised unequivocally by Western thinkers. And that leads to the final link in the argument, when Chapra claims, "It is, however, not possible to render justice without first deciding what is right and what is wrong, what is just and what is unjust, and what is desirable and what is not desirable. This requires value judgments. How to make these value judgments? This is a crucial question on the answer to which depends the realization of justice. All major world religions, including Islam, insist that value judgments must be based on divinely revealed moral criteria. And thus, God is inserted into an academic discourse that otherwise rejects supernatural agency. And to be clear, this is not unusual. Christians try to insert their faith into philosophy of history, Hindus in archaeology, and so on. There are a lot of weak points in the secular stance of the humanities. This one's a little ironic, though, because the specific argument Chapra uses in that passage is actually addressed directly by Ibn Khaldun, who is pretty dismissive of it. Khaldun argues that the majority of the world's inhabitants have lacked divine revelation and have gotten by just fine setting rules without it. But you can see how Ibn Khaldun functions in the argument. If you simply turned up and asserted that people should change the way they analyse supply and demand because it says so in the Quran, you would be laughed at. No one in any academic discipline takes the authority of the Quran seriously. But that is what a section of Islamic scholars want. Writing about another advocate, Al-Salamuti, Zemin summarises, "The Islamic Sharia has stipulated a complete and perfect structure of social systems, including the family, economy, politics, administration, legislation, education, etc. In contrast to the positivist, read Western views on these systems, the Islamic view considers God as their source. But unless someone is, like Al-Salamuti, right out on the fringe of the Islamicization project, then going to know a direct claim like that will seem absurd. Ibn Khaldun is a roundabout way of rendering it admissible. He serves other purposes as well, but I think this is the central one. He was a jurist, an Islamic scholar. He lived in a world which did not question the Quran's claim to divine revelation, and as I covered in the introduction, he took seriously claims of supernatural knowledge, and in turn, Western thought takes him seriously. Just to be clear, but it's just an extension of what I said in the last section, I don't think religious apologists are being dishonest when they make these sorts of arguments. Look at it from their point of view. There's a divine revelation which they know with absolute certainty to be true, and yet the academic discipline that they may in fact be a member of rejects it out of hand, won't even look at the data. I can understand how that's deeply frustrating and how in that situation you would look for weak points like this to try and insert your personal beliefs into the academic discourse. As I say, I don't think it's a dishonest activity. Anyway, while this is not without philosophical or theological interest, we could get into the difference between moralities rooted in revelation and those rooted in metaphysics, to pick up just one interesting thread from Chapra's remark. And it does align with the ideas of some secular economists. On YouTube, there is New Economic Thinking, which is very much interested in inserting morality into economics without any religious motivation. But those are not rabbit holes I want to pursue today. The point is that Ibn Khaldun is central here, and this intellectual strand, Islamic economics, blurs into the work on the gap that we discussed before. And undoubtedly, that is a big part of why filling the gap does not lead to contextualizing Khaldun, and thus does not lead to a re-evaluation. And it ties into the fact that Khaldun is useful from lots of different points of view. Neoliberal political advisors and religious apologists might occupy radically different positions, but as long as they both find the Muqaddimah's positive reception in the academy useful, they are motivated to repeat and promote that positive assessment. I don't want to mislead. There absolutely are scholars who have re-evaluated the Muqaddimah, who suspect that the reception is misleading and the work is less original and more dated than is often assumed. For example, Al-Azmeh, who we've already turned to for a dissenting opinion, has this to say about it. The bulk of Ibn Khaldunia has unfortunately been devoted to a universalist conception of Ibn Khaldun as a thinker whose importance resides in having been the father of sociology, the father of economics, and similar spurious historical and conceptual constructions. When I'm doing this sort of thing, my reading tends to come in tranches. I'd pretty much worked out how I was going to do this episode at this point, got the rough outline of the script together, had discussed it with Isa, and was rereading the abridged version of Rosenthal's translation. But after I read Al-Azmeh's position, in the context of what I was thinking myself, I then used citation tools to find material that referenced Al-Azmeh, and then dumped a whole bunch of that to my Kindle so that I could read through it and try and assess if this was a lone position and how other people responded to it. There are more than 200 citations of Al-Azmeh, and yes, amongst them, though it is a minority, you do find people engaging in exactly the same type of re-evaluation. For example, the uniqueness of the Al-Muqaddimah is in the composite nature of the work. It combines two elements in different fields of Islamic scholarship: the method for establishing the soundness of historical information from hadith studies and the topic of history from the Tariq literature. Basically, all Ibn Khaldun did was take a method from a branch of Islamic scholarship and apply it to another branch. Both the method and the branch he applied it to were quite familiar to his colleagues and not radical novelties as such. I wouldn't want to endorse this. The article doesn't offer a lot of data or analysis, but Alatas does come to a very similar, though more positive conclusion, suggesting that it's a plausible reading of what's going on. But this is the exception. While there are lots of citations of Al-Azmeh, the vast majority do not question the tradition of Khaldun's unparalleled brilliance. They do sometimes offer defences of Khaldun's brilliance, and the most common one is that the work is full of untapped potential. It is trivially simple to find examples of articles which claim that Ibn Khaldun is essentially unheard of in the scholarly community, or that the Muqaddimah has been largely ignored. Of course, this is nonsense. We have seen that thousands of articles have been written, and in case we all forgot the inciting incident that got me looking at this, I'm a specialist in northwest India in the early century CE, completely different to 14th century North Africa, and I had not just heard of Khaldun, I'd actually read enough of the Muqaddimah to spot that a citation was wrong. But I don't think it's hard to understand why this particular notion keeps appearing in the introduction of articles. If you perceive Khaldun as prophetic, as having anticipated a host of intellectual developments, and you can point to sections which appear to discuss supply and demand or value theory of labour, it becomes natural to assume that there must be much still in there waiting to be found. And that is self-reinforcing. Yes, we know it's not true because we've just spent more than an hour tracing its reception. We know that Khaldun, the most famous Arab historian, with the possible exception of Tabari, has been widely read and studied from his own lifetime down through modern European philosophy, economics and sociology. But it is possible to have not heard of Khaldun, and if you haven't, you could play semantics with words like known or famous. After all, as Isa suggested to me while writing the script, he's not Taylor Swift. And you could use that to justify a suggestion that Khaldun has been neglected. And therefore, when you find something that seems familiar, it's easy to read it as a prediction. So finally, let's talk about the Muqaddimah as prophecy. Every pre-modern historian has to deal with prophetic texts, accounts which are purporting to tell you what will happen in the future. For example, the various Buddhist narratives prophesying the end of the Sangha 500 years after the Buddha lived. Do you know what I can say with confidence about all of those prophecies? They were all written 500 years after the Buddha lived. In fact, that is universal for prophecy. Prophecies are always easy to write after the events have happened, so when you find a prophetic account, you can date its composition pretty accurately. And as I've noted a few times up to this point, Khaldun has been treated prophetically in the reception as having anticipated, founded, or originated things before they were officially discovered. But those profound insights into classical economics, sociology, monetarism, and so on, always after the fact. Like prophecy, people read something in Khaldun only after they already know it. Zemin makes precisely this point about the sociologist Richard Spickard's use of Khaldun, and writes, whereas Spickard argued that looking through non-Western eyes brings into sight aspects that a Eurocentric gaze is missing, it seems clear that these aspects were visible before turning to Ibn Khaldun, and that Spickard appropriated the latter very selectively to highlight those aspects. Spickard is thus less formulating a Khaldunian approach, but rather is appropriating Ibn Khaldun from within contemporary sociological discourse to make a critical intervention that would have been equally possible without reference to Ibn Khaldun. And that, I would argue, goes all the way back to Toynbee. Toynbee was writing an account of how civilizations rose and fell at a time when new social sciences were seen as productive for historians, and unsurprisingly found all of those things in a selective reading of Khaldun. But Toynbee found them by looking for them. Nothing in Khaldun inspired or suggested those ideas. It just lent authority. We have seen that borrowing of authority repeatedly, both for neoliberals and Islamic apologists, and even to an extent for the people filling in the gap thesis. And we can imagine how that acts as its own self-sustaining feedback loop. People find their ideas in the work and then borrow the authority its universal praise lends. That act of borrowing gives the impression Khaldun anticipated the idea, lending yet more authority to the Muqaddimah and encouraging others to look for their ideas in the text. Here we are, at the end of the video, and in need of a conclusion. And as I warned you, it's been a long time getting here. My cup of tea didn't make it all the way through the episode. I suspect the final episode will be longer than any I've previously done that wasn't on Die Studies. It might even be longer than any of the Die Studies episodes. But that's just the nature of research. Yes, there's a bit of insight and critical judgment in everything you do, but most research is just legwork. If we want to understand how the Muqaddimah is received and understood, then the only way to do that is to read the works that responded to it. And when you get to the end of something, the answers look obvious. The Muqaddimah is not as radical a text as European scholars have tended to paint it. It was embedded within a rich intellectual tradition which both informed and responded to it. It has been extolled and promoted through feedback loops that have been sustained at theoretical levels, whether neoliberal politics, cyclical history, or Islamic apologetics, and at fairly mundane levels through self-promotion and a desire to claim authority. In the process, selective readings have given it a prophetic aura by effectively misrepresenting its contents and failing to contextualise it. It remains, and I want this point to come across very strongly, a fascinating historical source for 14th century North Africa. But I hope at the conclusion that you can see why it has nothing to tell us about 21st century tax policies, and are better armed to be able to see the difference between what a text tells us and how we can use a text. The history of the latter, how Ibn Khaldun has been used, is a fascinating one which I have only scratched the surface of, and perhaps you are better armed not to fall into the trap of finding what you already know in something you read. I certainly hope you got something out of the episode if you made it all the way to this point. If you're interested in pursuing the subject, then I recommend reading Rosenthal's translation. There is no substitute for just sitting and reading the thing people talk about, but I think it is useful to do that framed by at least some secondary literature. I would strongly recommend 3 pieces from amongst my own reading. There is an overwhelming consensus that Alatas is the best scholar working on this. Alatas has produced a general introduction, but I wouldn't actually suggest that. I would suggest applying Ibn Khaldun. It is, I believe, the best presentation of the opposite view to my own, that Khaldun is relevant, in that case to sociology. Obviously, it's not a view I agree with, or I wouldn't have spent several hours doing this, but it's a perspective I found very interesting and valuable. I would also recommend Syed. It gives a good sense of the intellectual context by summarising and discussing other works both before and after, with a particular focus on economic thought. And finally, if you're interested specifically in the economic aspect, I would suggest Spengler's article. Of the 3 I discussed in the wake of Rosenthal's translation, I found this to be the one that held up best, and it's also the one that is most widely cited. But if you have any other recommendations, please do leave them in the comments below.